All right, seniors. How are you? Okay, I said yesterday there's going to be like a quiz on Friday. No, forget it. Because look, I'll just make the essay that you turned in to me 100 years ago, the final grade, and please don't worry about it because, you know, it's going to be fun. I promise you. I would not just say that. No, I would not. Okay, here we go. So, and I'm sorry again. I'm very sorry that it hasn't gotten graded. Yeah, I really am. I feel really bad. Okay, look. So we're going to talk about Vietnam. Yesterday we talked about why there was escalation starting in 1965. Okay, so now we're going to talk about that actual process and the consequences of that. Okay, so American morale was pretty good in 1965. You had pretty modest death rates, okay, and the soldiers performed very well in combat against the Viet Cong, the supporters of Ho Chi Minh. So there was pretty good morale both among the soldiers, but there was even, for the most part, support for the war in the United States. There was the beginning of opposition and protest in 1965, but it wasn't really more till towards the end of that year where it got very widespread. Okay, now, starting in 1966, though, morale is going to implode, and death counts are going to rise a lot, both for the Americans and for the Viet Cong. Part of the reason for this is that the military leaders and McNamara, the defense secretary, are measuring American success in Vietnam according to how many Viet Cong are killed, the death counts. That was how they said, they would have like certain, anyway, they would measure success based on how many Viet Cong had been killed, okay? And so they would kill, a bunch would get killed, and they would come on TV and they would say America was having success in Vietnam. The problem is that Ho Chi Minh has a whole lot of people at his disposal. He's like 19 million Vietnamese in the north people, and of course supporters in the south, or people who are pressed into service in the south. So he's always got people to replace the soldiers that are killed. So even though you're killing a lot of Viet Cong, you're not necessarily undermining Ho Chi Minh because he's going to bring in, you're not undermining Ho Chi Minh because he's going to bring in new soldiers to replace those who've been killed. Now, a word on Ho Chi Minh. So, yeah, he has a lot of support. He also will kill you if you don't support him. So in other words, when they go into South Vietnam and they go into certain villages, if they find that the villagers are not cooperative, they might kill them. Okay? So Ho Chi Minh is not somebody to laud. Okay? And there's good reason for it, like not just because he's a communist, that's bad, but literally, look, because of the practices that he has there in Vietnam. Now so just keep that in mind, right? Like, okay. So he's got a lot of people at his disposal. So it's not like World War II where you got the Western Front moving east or the Eastern Front moving west. There's no way to mark the success that you have in Vietnam according to territorial gain or loss, because so much of the fighting is guerrilla fighting, where you are fighting over a hilltop or over a forest where there might be supply routes, or maybe there's a village that's very loyal to the Viet Cong or something. And then, you might win that battle as the Americans, and then decide that really that wasn't that important, and you might then abandon that strategic objective and surrender it back to the Viet Cong and go fight for another hilltop. So the territory was not, there was no clear way of measuring it with that, and so that was why they were using the death counts, okay? And again, that wasn't really a great way to measure effectiveness. Okay, so there's that. All right, now a little bit about the soldiers who are fighting in Vietnam for the Americans. They tend to be from the working class, not always, of course, but they tend to be. And of course, many of them are college educated to go back to the United States and go to college, but if you go into college, then you could get a deferral. You wouldn't have to be drafted until you would finish college, okay? So there was a benefit to being able to get into college and to afford it, right? All right, so that sort of also tells us a little bit about why people are fighting. So, of course, they're drafted into the army. That's the main thing. Or they're about to be drafted, so they volunteer, and so that they can have some say in when they deploy. Okay, typically they're there for 2 or 3 years. Okay, and they are moved around sort of largely as they're brought, like, you bring individuals into a unit as needed. Okay, so it's not like you have units that are you do have it, but a lot of times what's happening is not units that are training together and then going and fighting together. It's like individuals being sent here and there, and as you're being sent into one unit, some of the individuals who have finished their tour of duty are leaving. What's the point of all this? Well, it's hard to build camaraderie here because of the way that they're moving soldiers. It's also difficult to build camaraderie increasingly in 1966 and 7 because of the brutality of the fighting. Okay, it wasn't just the intensity with which the Viet Cong fought, which was very, very intense, but it was also the way in which you would die. So often it wasn't in a battle, so to speak. It was a skirmish. You go out on patrol, and there would be Viet Cong guerrilla fighters in the jungle waiting for you, and they would fire at you out of nowhere. So there's just this, and so you go out on patrol and not come back, right? That was common, right? Unfortunately. There's also added to sort of, it's unexpected, right? There's a terror element to it. You're never safe, right? There's always the threat. There's this pervasive threat hanging over you that you're going to be ambushed by these guerrilla fighters. Okay, so not only is it wearing on you psychologically that you might die at any time, but you're less likely to try to make friends with people who are going to go out on patrol that night and not come back. Okay, so camaraderie becomes more and more difficult to build and maintain. Not, of course, you don't want to overstate that, but that affects morale in a big way, right? If there's problems building camaraderie in some units. There's also a problem building rapport between the officers and the enlisted men because, again, the officers are not serving in certain units long enough. They usually serve about 6 or 7 months, so it's not really long enough to build trust and rapport with the men. And there's a lot of criticisms among the enlisted men of the Army, of the military leadership during the war, okay? All right. So another thing sort of adding to the problems and the anxiety is that there's the threat of friendly fire. And because of inadequate training in some cases or poor leadership, you had fairly high, what I understand, read to be 15 to 20% of casualties coming from friendly fire, coming from accidental fire, okay? All right, now, so added to that, right, is, this, as I mentioned, the intensity of the fighting, the intensity of the Viet Cong, and then the American response to that tends to be firepower. So sending bombs, napalm, Agent Orange, flammable, explosive materials down on the jungle or on the supply routes or on the villages sometimes where you think there's a lot of Viet Cong. Okay, so it's a very intense, difficult situation, and of course some soldiers are very troubled by how all this is going forward. Okay, so it's mentally and physically very difficult. Now, within American leadership, okay, there is doubts beginning to emerge by the end of 1965. If we look at Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who was urging Johnson to increase troop levels to 200,000 men. He was urging him to do that in July of 1965. He was urging him to escalate the war. Well, by the end of that year, December, he is full of doubts. He's riven with doubts, okay? He asked Johnson to declare a Christmas bombing halt for 37 days in order to try to initiate negotiations. He's asking Johnson, he's questioning whether the American people are going to be committed to this war, and if they're not committed to it, how can they win this war? See, this is another big difference between World War II and Korean War and this war, is that there wasn't the engagement of the public in the cause in the same way, right? There was a reliance on the draft as the way to do it. And so the soldiers are coming in and they're expecting to leave at a certain time. They're expecting to serve for a certain time and go home. There's not the same level of commitment to finishing the job and the cause. Now, I don't want to overstate that for the soldier. I mean, it's incredibly brave to go there at all, absolutely, but it's a different kind of scenario. The case has not been made to the American people in the same way about the necessity of the war and finishing the war, so that you have all these volunteers coming in who are not expecting to go home until the whole thing is over. These young men going over there are expecting to come home after a few months. That's all that, or a year or two, whatever it is. They're expecting to come home. So that's another difference there. And age was another big difference with the soldiers. The average age in World War II was 27. Same in the Korean War, I think. For Vietnam, it's 19, so much younger fighting force in Vietnam as well, okay? And so McNamara, he's watching the death counts rise. So within a few months of urging him, Johnson to go in and raise the numbers, he's having these doubts. And in 1967, he would be, like a year later, he's pacing around in his office weeping. And LBJ is kind of given up on McNamara because he thinks like this guy is not really helpful anymore. Okay, so the problem is it just seems like nothing is effective, and if you keep sending troops, there's not really an effective strategy being implemented. Okay, on the part of the leadership, even though the soldiers themselves are very heroic and brave. Most of them, of course, many of them, of course. All right.